Is she a prophet? A puppet? You know, it's wild to think that in just a few short years, Greta Thunberg has become one of the most recognizable and polarizing figures of our time. So today, we're going to unpack her incredible story from a solo protester with a hand-painted sign to a global icon. This is where it all began. A simple sign, a quiet determination, and a 15-year-old girl sitting all by herself outside the Swedish parliament. This single image kicked off a global phenomenon that I don't think anyone saw coming, least of all her. So, that's the big question, right? How on earth do we get from that, one person on the pavement, to a massive worldwide movement? That's the journey we're about to explore. Okay, so to really get the activist, you first have to understand the person. And her story, well, it doesn't actually start on those parliament steps. It goes back way earlier to a really deep personal struggle. I mean, just think about that for a second. At 8 years old, she learns about climate change. By 11, when most of us were worried about, homework or video games, she was battling some really serious stuff. The sheer weight of that knowledge, it literally made her sick. It silenced her. And this is such a crucial part of her story. She has Asperger's syndrome, but she doesn't see it as a weakness at all. In fact, she's famously called it her superpower. She says it's what gives her this intense, almost single-minded focus, the thing that makes it impossible for her to just look away from the hard facts of climate science. And this quote, wow, it just says it all, doesn't it? Because she experienced selective mutism, speaking wasn't something she did casually. When she finally chose to speak, it was because she felt it was absolutely critically necessary. All right, so let's get into how that one critical moment sparked a fire that, well, spread all over the world. The spark. That was the summer of 2018. You got to remember, Sweden was getting hammered by record heat waves and these just awful wildfires. For her, this wasn't some abstract, far-off problem anymore. It was happening in her backyard. So what did she do? She grabbed her bike, made that sign, and just started her strike. And things escalated fast. I mean, really fast. It's kind of like the perfect playbook for a modern movement. First, you've got the solo act. Then, step 2, social media. She posts a picture, and suddenly it's not a local story anymore. And boom, by the very next day, she's not alone. That daily strike quickly turned into the weekly Fridays for Future. Such a simple, powerful idea that anyone, anywhere could copy. And the scale of it? Well, it was just mind-blowing. To give you some perspective on this number, 20,000. She started her strike in late August, right? By December of that same year, we're talking just 4 months later, more than 20,000 students in hundreds of cities had joined her. This thing went from a spark to an absolute wildfire. Yup, that hashtag Fridays for Future hashtag just took over social media. Scenes just like this one in Berlin started popping up everywhere. The movement completely jumped borders, languages, you name it. It was this unifying force for young people who all cared about one urgent thing. So suddenly, she's got this massive global movement at her back. And her role, it had to change, right? She wasn't just a protester anymore. She became a voice. And she started taking that message to some of the most powerful rooms on the planet. So imagine this. She's at the World Economic Forum in Davos. She's surrounded by the world's biggest CEOs, presidents, the global elite. And she doesn't pull any punches. That line, "Our house is on fire," it's so simple, so terrifying, and so effective. It became her calling card, a wake-up call that you just couldn't ignore. And she had this really interesting strategy when she went to speak to places like the US Congress or the European Parliament. She would often refuse to give some big emotional speech about her own feelings. Instead, she'd just hand them the latest scientific reports. Her message was basically, look, this isn't about me. This is about the data. Don't listen to me, listen to the scientists. But the one that everyone remembers, the one that truly went viral, was her speech at the UN. That raw emotion, the sheer anger in her voice when she said, "How dare you?" I mean, it just cut through everything. It was this generational indictment of inaction, delivered with a passion that was just impossible to look away from. Okay, so with this massive global platform, she obviously had a much bigger voice, and she started using it in new ways. Her activism began to evolve, moving beyond just the climate and into some new and, let's be honest, more controversial areas. And you can really see that shift right here.
early on, the focus was laser sharp, right? It was all about climate science, holding governments to the Paris Agreement. But over time, that broadened out into this idea of climate justice, the idea that climate change hits the poorest and most vulnerable communities the hardest. So she began connecting that to other human rights struggles, showing support for people in places like Ukraine, Armenia, and Palestine.
Her pro-Palestinian activism, in particular, has become a really significant, and for many, a very controversial part of her story. This timeline here just lays out the key moments, from social media posts that sparked a lot of criticism, to her getting directly involved with flotillas trying to reach Gaza, which, as you can see, led to her being detained and even deported by Israeli forces. And it wasn't just in her words, you could see it in her appearance too. When she wore a keffiyeh, which is a powerful symbol of Palestinian nationalism at a climate rally, well, that was a very deliberate choice. It absolutely solidified where she stood, but it also caused a rift, drawing praise on one side and some pretty significant backlash on the other. So all of this brings us to the big question, right? After everything, what's the actual impact? What is the legacy of what people call the Greta effect? Well, as you can probably guess, the reaction to her is completely polarized, and this chart really breaks down the two sides of the coin. On one hand, her supporters say, look, she started a global youth movement, she massively raised awareness, and she holds powerful people's feet to the fire. But on the other hand, critics will say her language is way too alarmist, her methods are just disruptive, and they question her role in these complicated debates. And really, that split, it's not just about her. It says a lot about how we view activism itself today. And her legacy so far really is a story of these wild contrasts. I mean, think about it. On one hand, she's named Times Person of the Year. On the other, she's racking up fines and arrests for civil disobedience. This list just shows that duality perfectly. Praised by major institutions, while at the same time being prosecuted by others for the very actions that made her famous in the first place. So we're left with this one last, really important question. She went from being this lone protester with a sign to a global icon who is now getting arrested at protests. As her story keeps unfolding, what does it tell us about the changing nature, the tactics, and maybe even the future of activism itself?